Hello from Jihad and the World, a podcast that explores the intersection of the Western and Islamic worlds. This is Mark Silinsky of Kensington Security Consulting, and we begin a 10-part series called Islamofascism. This first episode is called What is Islamofascism? It examines the intersection of Islam and fascism.
Of all the unanswered questions of our time, perhaps the most important is, what is fascism?
George Orwell. What is fascism? 1944. Without success, George Orwell struggled to define fascism. He served with communists during the Spanish Civil War, barely surviving a bullet that grazed his neck. During the fight, he and others referred to Francisco's Franco soldiers as fascists. Over time and reflection, he found similarities between the core principles of fascism and Stalinism. He despaired of finding an adequate definition of fascism. Orwell explained, "I have heard it applied to farmers, shopkeepers, corporal punishment, fox hunting, bullfighting, astrology, women, dogs, and I do not know what else." Today, defining fascism remains challenging. According to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini's grandson Caio Mussolini, you can't define it as good or bad. The era of Italian fascism was a complicated, nuanced period. Other writers avoid classifying fascism on the right or left side of the standard political spectrum. Many commentators use the term fascist interchangeably with far-right politics. However, journalist Jonah Goldberg popularized the term liberal fascism, citing Progressive President Woodrow Wilson's Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 as serious attacks on U.S. civil liberties. The political philosophy of fascism was first developed during World War I by Giovanni Gentile. His slogan was, "All within the state, none outside the state, none against the state." The first fascist movement to come to power was Mussolini's black shirts in Italy in 1922. For George Orwell and other political analysts, it was not easy to categorize Germany, Japan, and Italy under the same political framework. During World War II, the Soviet Union labeled the German military and political systems as fascist enterprises. Hitler admired fascism, but considered National Socialism a distinct, yet related, political ideology. When fascism took root in Europe in the 1920s, Islamist groups, or those groups that emphasize political and legal elements of Islam, gained a foothold in the Middle East. While different from their European counterparts, Berman notes they had similar mythology, paranoia, a cult of hatred, and a cult of death. In 1920s, Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood aimed to unify Muslims, expel non-Muslims, establish a unified Islamic theocracy, and crush the Zionist movement. President Bush's use of the term Islamic fascists to describe al-Qaeda-influenced terrorists underscores points of similarity between European fascism and the political elements of al-Qaeda. Paul Berman and Orwell pointed out that fascism and communism share important traits. They highlighted the similarities between fascist and communist governments. Journalists from the influential London newspaper, The Times, referred to the Soviet Union as a fascist country. The state controls most aspects of politics and society and seeks to impose uniformity of thought and action, whether through force or coercion. All the essentials of society must align with a leader's dictates. Columbia University professor Robert Paxton emphasizes fascism's focus on group identity, superiority, and victimization. James Gregor argues that ideologically diverse regimes like the Stalinist Soviet Union, Maoist China, and Fascist Italy share fascist-like traits, especially political absolutism. During its early phases, fascism was exclusively European. Italian fascist leaders did not actively seek followers from the Islamic world. However, Hitler's Foreign Office reached out to Muslims who shared hostility toward Jews and the British and French empires. Some Muslim intellectuals were drawn to National Socialism, a German combination of fascist and racial doctrines. Muslims also fought in Himmler's SS divisions. As European empires dissolved in the 1950s and 1960s, many Muslims turned to the Soviet Union as a model. Fascist political parties were banned in Europe, and Moscow's anti-imperialism message resonated on university campuses in the Middle East. However, some Muslim leaders, like Hajj al-Amin Husseini and Anwar Sadat, remember European fascists with a nostalgic warning. A prolonged conflict arose between religious and secular Muslims, particularly in North Africa, during the 1970s and 1980s. In Iran, Islamic revolutionaries formed a new government in the early 1980s, causing responses across the Shia world. Among Sunni Muslims, long-dormant fundamentalism was revitalized and heavily financed by rulers of oil-exporting countries. Some policymakers in Washington praised Afghan fundamentalist insurgents as freedom fighters, while others remained skeptical. Many observers were unsure how to interpret the numerous killings carried out by Muslims. Westerners hesitated to link the term fascism with Islam out of fear of appearing hostile to the religion. Journalists, politicians, and public officials avoided being seen as opposed Islam. 50 years after World War II, large Muslim communities remained unassimilated in European countries, especially in Britain, France, and Germany. Fascism with an Islamic face.
We love Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was an Arab. Eva Braun is also our cousin.
Shouts of young males at a rally in Germany, 2017. British historian Melise Ruthven described authoritarian Muslim governments in the Middle East as Islamo-fascist. After the September 2001 attacks in the United States, some journalists, including Stephen Schwartz and Christopher Hitchens, used the term to characterize the extreme authoritarian aspects of Islam. The late conservative Catholic commentator Joseph Sobran dismissed Islamofascism as an empty propaganda term. Islamofascism refers to the use of Islam as a cover for totalitarian ideology. Today, this radical phenomenon is represented among Sunni Muslims by fundamentalists like the Saudi-funded Wahhabis, Pakistani jihadists known as Jama'atis, and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Shia Islamofascism is exemplified by Hezbollah in Lebanon and the group around the revolving leaders of Iran. But the term entered mainstream media when President George W. Bush referred to a thwarted suicide attack on airplanes as a stark reminder that this nation is at war with Islamic fascists. President Bush used the term on October 6, 2001, when speaking to the National Endowment for Democracy. He described this murderous ideology of Islamic radicals as the great challenge of our new century. But the answer was anything but simple. Some academics favored the term Islamism, but Bush's aides thought it sounded too much like America was fighting the entire religion. Another option was jihadism, which many Muslims see as a positive word that doesn't necessarily bring to mind bloodshed. Some preferred the conservative buzzword Islamofascism, which was catchy and fit well with Bush's historical view of the struggle. But when National Security Advisor Steve Hadley called the CIA, the Pentagon, and the State Department, the experts rejected the idea of using a single phrase for such a complex war. There was a conscious desire not to use just one definitive word, because there wasn't a perfect one, recalls Michael Gerson, Bush's chief speechwriter at the time. The result was a confusing mix of words. Some call this evil Islamic radicalism, Bush explained. Others, militant jihadism. Still others, Islamofascism. Whatever it's called, this ideology is very different from the religion of Islam. 5 years after 9/11 and more than 3 years after invading Iraq, President Bush is still searching for the perfect phrase to define the enemy in the war on terror and to reassure Americans who will soon head to the polls. Other Republicans, including former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, adopted Islamofascism as shorthand for terrorists. The term gained currency in the early 90s in reference to radical Muslim clerics and was popularized after 9/11 by neocons. In the same year that President Bush compared Islamism to fascism, the top U.S. military official in the Middle East, General John Abizaid, compared the rise of Islamist ideologies to the explosion of fascism in Europe during the 1920s and 1930s. He stressed the importance of confronting it. If we don't have enough guts to confront this ideology today, we'll go through World War III tomorrow. Abizaid gave this speech at Harvard University. Another military official, Colonel Dale C. Eichmeyer from the U.S. Army War College, stated that Qutbism is a variant of Islamic fascism, and the war on terrorism is also a war against Islamic fascists. Intellectuals such as Norman Podhoretz and Christopher Hitchens also use the term Islamofascism to describe al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups. Podhoretz warned that the West will need to fight a Fourth World War against the Islamo-fascists, while Hitchens defended Islamofascism as a valid term and more than merely propaganda for the Bush regime. In the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks against the USA, Hitchens argued that al-Qaeda represented a fascism with an Islamic face. In 2007, the neoconservative activist David Horowitz launched a series of lectures and protests on college campuses in the USA under the banner of Islamofascism Awareness Week, which led to accusations of Islamophobia by some Muslim students and anti-racist groups. Decades later, the debate still rages, which is the subject of the podcasts you will soon hear. Thank you for listening to this first episode of Islamofascism. Our latest book, Cauldron of Terror, Hamas, Israel, and the World, will be available for purchase in July 2026. This podcast does not reflect the official position of the United States government. Until next time, goodbye from Kensington Security Consulting.